Today, I have Madhava Setty back. Dr. Setty, who is an anesthesiologist and author, and is now the science advisor to the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And we're going to go back in time about 24 years and 23 and talk about what happened on September 11th, 2001, and why it's important. So I'm going to let you start, Madhava, and I'll just
Oh,
interrupt with questions every so often.
yes, I know you will. Thank you. There is another massive age-old institution that exacts an enormous toll on our prosperity, our physical and emotional health. And I'm talking about the institution of war, something that predates vaccines, glyphosate, and cell towers. People get killed and resources are depleted. Infrastructure is destroyed. Wars make people weaker, hungrier, poorer, and more susceptible to disease. So, in my opinion, if we're truly interested in the health of our children and our planet, we need to take a hard look at military conflict and what's really behind it. And secondly, children's health defense has been and always will be effective and enduring because foundationally its mission is based in science, right? Not the pseudoscience peddled by captured agencies and institutions riddled by conflicts of interest and packaged as consensus by legacy media. So, because we're a scientific organization and we're concerned with the health of our children and our planet, I believe that 9/11 is a topic, especially right now. We're so close to the 23rd anniversary of those events that we need to look at this in a very, very scientific way first. And then, perhaps we can expand upon what are the implications of the science, which is what we do here with regards to, biologics or all the other things that are in our environment. So my approach to this is unique. And before I get started, I want to say, and you brought this up to me offline, Meryl, is that most of the audience here probably is aware of the fact that there's some fishy things going on with the official story around 9/11. And that's great. But in order to really move the needle into a direction that helps us, we have to convince other people of this. And our friends, but also people in science, people in applied sciences, like architects and engineers, and people who have professional institutions that can come together and demand a reinvestigation of those events, because that's going to be crucial if we want to fix things. So my approach here, I think, is rather unique because I'm going to rely primarily on undisputed video that has been available to the public for 2 decades, and also mainstream media and official technical documents that are provided by our own government, specifically the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is, as we hopefully know, is a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce. So let's go to the first picture, okay? And I want to ask us, what did we observe on that day? And this is a picture of the North Tower as it was going down. And my question to you is this building falling down or is it blowing up? Right? It's not an easy question to answer. And the reason why this is important is before we just capitulate that our eyes can deceive, what can you tell? Most of the official investigation had to do with what was observed, because they didn't have any physical evidence. All of that stuff, was on a slow boat or a fast boat to China, and Ground Zero was completely scrubbed of almost all the physical evidence. And there are no cameras inside the building, so most of what they did came from what did it look like. So what is this? I say it's hard to tell at first glance, but because we've all been inured to think that this building came down from, a pancake and collapse, we automatically jump to the conclusion that, oh, it's falling down. I happen to have run an experiment, if you will, with my son and his friends when they were younger, and they didn't know about 9/11. And they happened to walk into my office as I was writing something, and they were asking me what I was doing. And I put up an image like this, and a video, which I'll show you, we're all going to see, and ask them, like, what does this look like? They didn't know about 9/11, and they all universally, this is beginner's mind. Oh, it's blowing up. So let's just look at this openly.
Okay,
And
but let me also
Mhm.
say, but the third issue is fire making it look like that,
Right.
right? We're seeing
So
smoke, or
that's
are we seeing dust? Are we seeing particulates from the building, or are we seeing smoke from jet fuel?
correct. So I say in this picture, it looks like there's smoke and there's particulate matter, because where's the building, right? Where's the top of the building? It's not there. This is a very important observational cue. All of it is being expelled outward and upward. Otherwise, there'd be a building there. So that sort of, the the hair on the building there is an enormous amount, a large fraction of the material in the building
So it
being
looks like there's a
pulverized.
small stalk and then lots of billowing clouds and smoke above it. And then it looks like there's another building in front of it that is obstructing our view of the stalk. And which building is this? Is this building 2?
This is building 1. This is the North Tower, which was struck first but fell second. So yeah, you're right. We have a little bit of an obstructed view. We're going to get very, very good views of what happened, but it's interesting to note that just from the picture alone, it looks suspicious. I'd say you'd be very hard pressed to prove that the top is crushing the bottom. There is no top.
Right. How
But
tall
let's
was this building? How high up should that stalk have been before anything happened?
Right. Well, this is the North Tower. So the plane that struck, which is also where what we were told was the initial crush zone, was centered around the 96th floor. So there should be 14 floors of intact building, i.e. the pile driver, which NIST says was the causative agent that crushed the rest of the building. There should be, 14 stories of building above this. But I must say that this picture was taken halfway through the collapse. So let's cue up the sequence from which this frame was taken. So there you see the top of the building and the tower. We see explosions, and then it's falling. Thank you. So before, shrugging our shoulders and saying that, we can't tell, again, this is what NIST and videos like this is what NIST used as a substantial part of their analysis. So if it appears, I'm going to ask you this question. If it looks to you like it's falling down, use your imagination and ask yourself, what would it look like if it was being blown up from the top down? I mean, I'm asking you, I'm asking the audience here, like, how would it appear? I would
Well, I
say,
think if it were falling down, I would expect lots of big pieces going
right,
down. I wouldn't expect all of this dust and then the top of the building seemingly disappearing.
exactly. So this is what it would look like to me, at least. I mean, having never seen really a building being blown up from the top down. We've seen many, many buildings being blown up from the bottom up as we use controlled demolition to take down old buildings. But this is rather unique in the sense that if it's being blown up, it's being blown up from the top down, which is very important, because if that is the case, which I believe it is, the the explosives that were used must have been, if they were explosives, must have been highly, highly energetic, because you're not using the weight of the building to take part in the crushing of the building. So typically, these charges would be placed and synchronously detonated, such that the weight of the building would bring the building down on its own as the infrastructure is being compromised from the bottom. But if it's being blown
Okay.
up from the top down, that requires a lot of energy, and we would expect that things would be thrown very far. And that's exactly what happened, as we will see. So, and the other thing to note there is, like, if it was being crushed and falling down, where is the top part? So in that sequence, we see the top part, we see it disappear, and then we see the rest of the building go down. That's what I saw.
Yes, that's what I thought.
So, right. So I'm glad that we can come to some consensus. I think most people would see that. As a matter of fact, I wrote a piece on my Substack last year about going to my classmates at MIT during our 35th anniversary of our reunion. And these were all like super high-tech guys. They were all engineering majors. We happened to be there was one doctor there actually, but most of them were engineering majors. And the conversation quickly turned to 9/11 because people asked me, so Madhava, what have you been doing? And I said, well, I've been really working very hard on the misdirection around COVID and 9/11. And they were willing to look at videos uh, just on my iPhone. And they all said that it looked like it was falling down, not being blown up. So it was fascinating because like you could see even highly technical minds that we would all consider at least are in the top quarter of IQs couldn't see what we see right in front of us with an open mind. So there's an enormous amount of bias in the public's minds. Now I want to talk about physics just for about 10 seconds. By 10 seconds, I mean a minute. What I want to introduce here is one of the fundamental principles by how the physical world behaves, which is the laws of motion, Newton's laws of motion. And the third law is paraphrased as, for every action, there is an opposite reaction. But as it applies to the system we're looking at, if the top of the building is applying enough force to the bottom to pulverize it as it falls, the top part, if there is a top part, must also get pulverized. Why? It's because both parts are made of the same stuff. In fact, the bottom is sturdier than the top because it was built to support more weight. The thickness of the girders and columns are, in fact, more heavily designed because the lower part had to support the upper part. And so it would be inefficient to use the same amount of steel at the very top because you didn't have to. So the idea that the top part of the building could crush the bottom without getting crushed itself is, according to laws of motion, impossible. And the idea of impossibility is another concept I'd like to bring up here, because when people hear that there's an alternative theory to the demise of these buildings, they immediately jump to, well, that would mean that, there's a large number of people that would have to be hiding something, and that would be impossible. That's not impossible. What we call that is highly improbable. And there is a, enormous difference between an event that's impossible and something that's improbable. In fact, the difference is infinite because things that are impossible can't happen. So if you're going to agree that we can send rockets into space and push things around, you have to at least understand that that's based on the third law of motion. We have to throw everything away if we're going to say that the top part of the building crushed the bottom. But to put it into simpler terms, like imagine having a brick and crushing it into dust with a pickaxe. You can do it, right? But what if the pickaxe was made of brick? Every time you'd strike the brick with a brick pickaxe, both brick and the pickaxe would disintegrate if you struck it with enough force. It has to happen that way, right?
I think we get it.
Okay, good. So now, when I first looked at this 7 years ago, and believe me, I'm not a newcomer to this. I was well behind the curve compared to all the other people who have been trying to bring the truth out about 9/11. I saw that and I said, I didn't go to YouTube or the internet to find out what happened. I went straight to the official explanation given by the National Institute for Standards and Technology in their document, which is titled NC Star 1, Final Report on the Collapse of the World Trade Center Towers. So I started reading the document. Like, what is the official explanation? How did they possibly explain this? And what we see here with regards to the first tower, they say, and it's circled there, the downward movement of the structural block was more than the damaged structure could resist, and global collapse began. And they say that's the same exact wording they say for Tower 2, which is the South Tower. What they mean by the structural block is the top part of the building. This is the pile driver, the thing that's driving down the bottom. And we are being asked to believe that this pile driver dismembered 100,000 tons of steel, more or less, reinforced steel, before crushing itself. So it's impossible to overstate how phenomenally unscientific this statement is. Why was the down?
Can we just stop here, because you're getting very technical, even for me.
Okay.
Can we just say that the government agency tasked to explain what happened, because no buildings had ever done this before, made up a phony excuse that didn't make any logical sense, and published it and walked away?
Yep. That's correct. And the reason why I've highlighted these two statements is because they're just saying that that's what happened. They didn't tell us why it happened. They just said, well, it was more than the bottom structure could sustain. So a global collapse began. They don't explain what happened during the global collapse. And
right, because they can't, because there is no explanation, because that's not what happened.
That's correct. That's what
they're trying to come up with words that sound good, that most people, won't understand, and their eyes will glaze over and they'll go on.
That's absolutely right. And one last thing to put up here, because this is where they explicitly say that they didn't do an investigation. So this is summary of findings. I've circled in that little circle there the reference, and I'll read it for the audience if you can't read it. And it says, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence. And here's the kicker. Although it includes little analysis of the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. What does that mean? They're saying, we didn't do the investigation. We're not going to tell you why the building fell. We're just going to tell you, we're going to speculate as to what was happening inside the building. And our hypothesis is correct. Why? Because the building fell. So it must be like they're completely not doing the investigation. And I just want to mention here that there is over 10,000 pages of technical documentation that NIST put forward with just regard to the Twin Towers. And none of it has even a single reference to, well, how much did the top of the building weigh? What was the tensile strength of the steel that was supposed to support it? How much weight could the bottom building support? They don't do the calculation, because this is not an investigation. They just told us in complicated terms.
There's a phrase for this. If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. So that's why the report is 10,000 pages.
That's precisely correct.
Yes, so that you don't, by the time you've finished reading it, you just don't know what you've seen, because you've been taken everywhere, all over the place, except to the place where you actually wanted to go.
Right. Well, at least they had the decency of telling us explicitly, as I said, that they did not look at the structural behavior of the building. Basically, they're saying we didn't do an investigation. They did not,
because we can't, because we cannot give you the narrative we're supposed to if we actually investigate the physics and the engineering of the building. Therefore, we're going to talk around it. And
that is the direct implication. Yes, that's exactly right. So why did the towers fall? Because they were hit by planes. And how do we know that there wasn't another mechanism in play? Well, it's because after the planes hit, the building fell. That's what that entire
exactly
says. Right.
Yes.
And so now I want to get into something more interesting, which is
And
why
by
did
the way, my guess is that these buildings are engineered such that they won't fall if they're hit by planes. Because I remember as a student at MIT, my
Mhm.
roommate was doing civil engineering and was studying the building of nuclear power plants. And they were specifically engineered to withstand airplane crashes.
That's correct. And there are references that are out there that the biggest I believe commercial jet airliner that was available when these buildings were constructed in the early 1970s was the Boeing 707, and they were designed to withstand not just one but two collisions, if I'm not mistaken. So here's what I find interesting is, like, why did the public buy it? And Meryl, you've already hit upon it. They dazzled us with stuff. I would say the reason why most people buy the official story is that most people don't know that they didn't actually do an investigation. They didn't answer the central question that they were tasked to answer. But more importantly, and this is where it gets fascinating, is that the public more or less believes that the obvious explanation, as we've been given, was obvious from the start. And so here's something interesting for you to look at. This is page A3, and this is the actual paper. This was the New York Times late edition, September 12th, 2001. And what's
Okay,
really
so they've
fascinating,
already had 24 hours to adjust their story and make sure it fits the narrative, unlike the immediate edition after the
right?
event.
So they didn't know on September 11th, obviously, because this happened in the late morning. And so the next morning, or this is when the crack journalists at the New York Times were on the story, and already they have a very accurate technical drawing of a cross section of the Twin Towers, showing us the central columns, the peripheral columns, and if you look in the lower right hand corner, so we have this cross section. I'm looking at the lower right hand of the of this paper. By the way, this is page A3, and in journalism, we know that page A3 is the page that you look at after you flip the top page over, and that's what you're looking at. It's the right side. This is the second most viewed page in a newspaper after the front page. So we're being told what the story is. And look in the lower right-hand corner. Do you see that little, stick diagram underneath the structural diagram? That's depicting what we all saw, with the smoke clouds and everything. They're giving us what the explanation is. You have the technical diagrams up there that looks very, very fancy, and then they're showing us what it should have looked like if the explanation that there was a pancake and collapse, um, how it should have looked like. And in hypnotherapy, this is called anchoring, which means you offer something that is very, very real to your subject. Let's say you have someone that wants to quit smoking, for example, and as you're sitting there doing hypnosis, you mention something that is unequivocally true, like, as you're sitting there in this comfortable chair and feeling the carpet underneath your bare feet, you now feel the sensation of nausea when you think of smoking. So you link those two things together. And here, what we see here is a very emotive picture at the top. Like, this is the Twin Towers has been reduced to absolutely nothing. And you've got the NYPD and FDNY looking up at what just happened, this enormous tragedy. And then you're given the explanation as to why that is. This is a psyop, in my opinion. This is exactly the beginnings of how you convince the public of a story. Right from the get-go, we knew what happened. They're telling us. Now,
Okay, so you've got a 110-story building and it
yeah,
collapses, and these people can walk amongst the ruins of it the next day. I mean,
yeah,
110 stories plus all the furniture,
yeah.
all the columns. Um, how you would think you would be left with a many-story mess of girders and various things stuck to get, together. And here they seem to be walking. It's like, where did all the construction material go? And then we learn that there was all of this dust, inches of dust in lower New York City.
That Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because, how do we know that's true? Well, first of all, look at the picture. We're looking at a 110 story structure, or two of them. And of course, there were 6 floors below, I believe about 6 floors, but above the ground, there was only about 1 or 1.5 floors of debris. So you went from 110 stories to, let's say, 6 or 7 stories tops. Where did the building go? And George Pataki, who was the governor of New York at the time, did this really interesting interview with, I believe, a CNN reporter that walked around Ground Zero. And Governor Pataki is talking, and he's like, "We're mystified. There are no big chunks of concrete. There is no debris field anywhere near here, but yet Lower Manhattan, as you said, is covered with a blanket of pulverized concrete 3 inches thick. The building did not fall down. Those buildings disintegrated. This is not what you'd expect from a gravitational collapse. There was an enormous amount of energy that was expended to reduce this structure to nothing but dust. So in that lower segment of the New York Times, page A3, they tell you this. They say, one, after the plane struck, thousands of gallons of jet fuel burned, thick layers of insulation on the steel columns were breached and sprinkler systems were disabled. Fires broke out. The steel columns softened in the heat, separated from each other and buckled. And finally, weighted down by debris, furniture, and concrete and steel, floors progressively collapsed. This is exactly what NIST says, more or less. So they're telling you the day after what happened. And so we have it now imprinted in our minds. Oh, that's what happened. We now have an explanation. And then when NIST comes out with their explanation, nobody really questions it. Here's the title of that article, which explains what happened. And it reads, "Towers believed to be safe proved vulnerable to an intense jet fuel fire," experts say. Already they have experts. And highlighted in that article is, quote, "No structure could have sustained this kind of assault," says one expert. So, Meryl, you've seen this many times before. They find one expert who is going to give them
Or
the
they
statement,
make up an expert.
or
But
they made up an expert.
usually, in my work with the anthrax letters, they would
Mhm.
cite experts or, administration official, and they would never give you the name. And when they don't
Right,
give you the name, they're giving you the narrative because
right.
the person who said it is not willing to stand behind it, which means it's
Perhaps.
almost always a lie.
Yes, I
Um,
believe this person was named, but you could find anybody you wanted to. I mean, and how is it possible, honestly, that an expert the next day could say, "Oh, well, of course, this was, you know, uh,
well, you've always
bound to
got
happen."
pundits who want to say whatever on TV, right?
Right,
They
right.
don't care whether
And
they're right or wrong, just as long as I get to be on TV. But
yeah,
now of course we know that the cult of experts is a false that's a false god. Um,
correct.
we
Yeah,
have to become our own experts now. We can't
right.
trust the experts because they're all being paid by somebody to do a job, and that job may be to fool us.
Well, Meryl, you're getting very conspiratorial, and I'm trying to stick to the science, but that's exactly right. That's the way it works. So hopefully we can see with our own eyes, with simple language, that they like, this expert that's quoted in the New York Times is basically saying, "Oh yeah, let's throw away the third law of motion because that's what happened." That's basically what this person is saying. And because the New York Times legitimizes it, it must be right. But it isn't right. So now let's look at why did the towers really fall? And here's where the predominant um, theory held by 9/11 truthers, of which I consider myself one, is a controlled demolition. And what I mean by that is there were charges, explosive charges, cutting charges that were planted in the building.
Professionally placed by people
Precisely.
whose job it is to know how to blow up buildings.
Exactly. It's not just demolished, it was demolished in a controlled way, which is
Now,
why
how
most.
could that have happened? I mean, these are big buildings. It must have taken a long time to put all these charges in. How could it be done without the people in the buildings who work there knowing it?
you're sounding very conspiratorial, Meryl. They would have
No,
to
I'm
have been.
not. I'm asking you a very simple scientific question.
They must have been in on it. They must have
No, no,
been in.
obviously the people who worked there and got killed weren't in on it. So where were the charges placed? At what time were they placed? How could they be placed in such a way that the regular people who were going to be killed later didn't notice?
Right. So, that's a very good question, and it's interesting. The typical answer amongst our group is when we're asked, "How do they bring the explosives into the building?" And our answer is on a pallet. In other words,
Sure.
all the, huh?
Disguised as something else. That makes
Yes,
sense. Okay. They got
yes,
them, were they put into, for example, into the elevator shafts where obviously the people who work there are not inside the elevator shafts?
that's correct. So, here we're going with the idea of controlled demolition. If we're going to go with the most likely theory, at least using technology that we're aware of and that we've used before to take down buildings, you would have to bring explosives into the building over a period of weeks to months, presumably, and the central columns had to have been lined with explosives. And how would they do that? Well, it just so happens that the central columns house the enormous elevator system in these two buildings. And it is well published that both elevator systems underwent a huge renovation in the months before 9/11. And so looking at it that way, it wouldn't be so hard if you had the security involved. And I'm not talking about the guys that are standing at the lobby of the building, knowing that explosives are bringing into the building, but the ones who are engineering this setup are wearing ID badges, and the guards are saying, "Okay, you can go on through. You've cleared security," and they just start working on it. And they close down the elevators, they bring in the pallets of equipment and set it up. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but it's not so unreasonable to think that would be the way that this would have been conducted. So here's what's interesting, among other things. So just to be clear here, in this explanation that that the towers came down from plane collisions and fire damage alone is what's called a hypothesis, right? It's a possible explanation that has no supporting evidence, because there is no evidence that plane collisions and fires were the only cause of the tower's demise. But their hypothesis is in violation of a law of motion. So if they were being scientific, they would have looked for another mechanism of destruction, and they didn't. So even though we can't be 100% certain of what brought the buildings down, we can be certain that it wasn't just the planes. That's what the laws of motion tell us. So why didn't the engineers, architects, and chemists at NIST not look, or why didn't they look for evidence of the most likely explanation, a controlled demolition, which is the placement of highly energetic incendiary charges that could be synchronously detonated? So they say in their executive summary that they found no corroborating evidence for a controlled demolition. NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives planted prior to September 11th. Okay? They're saying that there was no evidence that that's what happened. So when they were pressed in their press conferences afterwards, after they released this document in December of 2005, they were asked, did you find any evidence of explosives? And they said, no, we didn't find any. And when they were pressed further, did you look for any? They said, no, we didn't look for any because there was no reason to look for any, because there's no corroborating evidence other than the violation of the third law of motion.
Okay, so but it's possible to find thermite or some other explosive in the dust. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. But they didn't look for it. Other third-party investigators did find thermite. But here now we're jumping to a third party, and this is where, in the interest of offering an explanation that cannot be discounted
Challenge.
because, yeah, challenge is like, oh, well, I don't want to believe the third parties. Okay, don't believe the third parties. Let's see what our own mainstream media said. This is a montage of media reports that morning.
But as I was looking up, I saw the entire explosion. It looked exactly like the first two, but we certainly had the most perfect vantage point for that explosion. It was unbelievable. And
there has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower.
See the two towers, a huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
We're not sure exactly what happened, but there was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing. The reverberation and another explosion on the right-hand side.
Watch the right side. It's exploding. It's ripping apart.
On the far side of the building, there seemed to be another explosion, and also on the right-hand side, there was also another explosion. We're not sure if that was extra reverberation from what happened at the World Trade Center, or if that was an added explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
Again, there has been a second explosion here in Manhattan at the Trade Center.
And believe it or not, there was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it, came down, sending smoke and debris everywhere.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
A huge explosion, a huge rumbling cloud. We're taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
But it literally exploded and came down as though it had been hit.
We heard an explosion.
the explosion happened was shooting pieces of the plane. There are pieces of the plane on Church Street.
There's another explosion as we speak.
Something either exploded or fell off the side of the one building that was attacked.
Then the entire top of the building just blew up.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
You know, there are 36, at least in this montage, 36. This is mainstream media. And like we saw, it was Fox, it was MSNBC, it was CNN. Everybody was reporting explosions. Yet Nass said, well, there was no corroborating evidence, like nobody's, saw or heard explosions, but it was being reported widely that morning.
Right. So as I said, the same, I noticed the same thing when I studied the anthrax letters, which is that the immediate reports are reliable. People don't have anything to hide. They don't have an axe to grind. You have a lot of different reports. And then later, the narrative comes in and people are told what they should say and what they shouldn't say. The major media, like the New York Times, are all captured and they give a narrative, and it's as if the first few hours are wiped away. So it's really important to catch things during those first few hours or minutes. And you did that. The nice montage.
Yes. Well, I'm not responsible for that. This is put together by a number of 9/11 Truth movements, starting from architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and then the organization I'm affiliated with right now, the International Center for 9/11 Justice. There's an enormous.
So let me say this too. So when the plane struck the building, they didn't go down right away. It took quite a while, hours, for them to actually go down. And so the sound that people heard when they say, I heard a large, it wasn't the sound of the plane hitting, because that happened a long time before. It was a new sound, and suddenly a sound and the building goes down.
Exactly.
Which you don't have that if it's a fire or, some other internal change in the building.
Yes. So in that montage, we don't know exactly when those people heard the explosion. Some clearly were heard at the moment of initiation of the collapse, if you will. Some were heard before. And what I'd like to also bring to your attention is that Graham McQueen, whom you at least are acquainted with, who passed away recently, is just a very calm and but energetic voice of truth in this matter. He compiled a list of 156 New York Fire Department firefighters who, in their oral testimony that was collected by the Times, 156 of them, unprompted, brought up the fact that they heard, felt, or saw explosions. So for some reason, NIST didn't think that all of the corroborating evidence for explosives, they didn't consider any of it. They just said, well, we don't know. Nobody's ever mentioned explosions, but yet everybody was mentioning explosions. I mean, this is like, Orwellian. And, here's something that's interesting. This is a map of where human bone fragments were found in Manhattan. Some of these, the furthest one away is over a fifth of a mile away from ground zero. Now, this happens to be a map that was put together because a few years after 9/11, a Muslim organization wanted to build a mosque in Lower Manhattan. And people said, well, you really shouldn't, you shouldn't have a mosque so close to ground zero because Muslims were responsible for 9/11. So they said, well, it has to be at least farther away from ground zero than where human remains were found. And so that led to this map. And my point here is that, first of all, we have bone fragments. Now, Meryl, you're a physician like I am, and, the human body is fragile. But we're talking about what should have been crush injuries. Getting to bone fragments that are expelled 1,000 feet away or more takes an enormous amount of energy. And there is, of course, a lot of energy of the building coming down, but we're talking about energy density here, not just a lot of energy. It has to be
You're getting too technical.
Well,
I think you're right. Things happened in the streets around these buildings that can't be explained by the explanation we've been given. I mean, there were cars and buildings a couple of blocks away that had their windows knocked out, sometimes in a linear pattern, as if there was some sort of, like a laser had hit them. There were cars that were burnt in the front and were intact in the back. There were all sorts of weird things happening in the area around these two buildings collapsing.
But my point here is that if you have bone fragments, that means there was an enormous amount of energy imparted to a single body. This doesn't happen from getting crushed by a ceiling or a beam. So
right,
let's go
but
to
it does
7.
happen if people or body parts are being ejected from a very high energy explosion, and that's
this was an explosive event. Okay, so here we go. Amazingly, the misuse of science around and the scientific method around the Twin Tower investigation takes second stage to Building 7, which is what we're going to talk about right now. So this is a building that fell. This is the Salomon Brothers building, and it was situated a few hundred feet away from the North Tower, and it fell at 5:20 p.m.
only about 50 stories, so it was a more squat building, and
it was a
no
squat building.
Hit it.
No plane hit it. It fell at 5:20 p.m. in the evening. And yes, it was a squat building. It looked small compared to the Twin Tower, but it would be the tallest building in most states because, it's in Manhattan, so it looks like a small building. But in terms of floor space, it's very close to a building, in my hometown of Boston, the John Hancock building, which is one of the biggest structures in the Boston skyline. This, in fact, is the video that I saw in 2017 that just changed my life. How on earth can a building like that fall? Everybody who looks at that must say, it's going down fast, it's going down symmetrically. How is this possible if it wasn't hit by a plane even? How could that not be a controlled demolition? It's falling into its own footprint. And it does so very rapidly. As a matter of fact, the first couple of seconds goes in free fall, which means it's falling as fast as gravity. If you dropped your keys off the top of the building, it would have hit the ground a split second before you would have if you were standing on top. All of that steel and concrete puts up zero resistance, zero. That's impossible unless you have a controlled demolition. And so what I'd like to show you now here is what NIST said about this building. What's the explanation? And I'm going to go right to the fact that they didn't have any evidence, just like the Twin Towers. There's no physical evidence They come up with a hypothesis and they build a computer model. Let's just show us what their model showed. So what we'd expect here is that their model should look exactly like what we saw. If it doesn't look like what we saw, then their model is wrong. This is what their model did. This is only like 6 or 7 seconds long.
This is building 1?
This is building 7.
Oh.
This is building 7, the one we just saw the video of coming down from 4 different vantage points. So you see things are crumbling, and then they stop their simulation. So this is not what we saw. This is, and they stop it. And what's fascinating here is that they don't show us what happened. But now, for the first time in this presentation, I'm going to refer to a third party, which is the Civil Engineering Department from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And they were tasked to reproduce NIST's findings. And they built a model. And the first thing they did was they made sure that their model looked exactly like NIST's model, and it did. And so rather than stopping there, they actually did an investigation. They asked, well, we don't have the building, but we have a model. How do we make the model look like the building? What is the minimum number of columns that have to be destroyed in order to see the building come down? So without telling you how many columns were necessary, let's look at what their model looks like once they figured out what's the minimum. This is what they did. It's the same model as NIST. NIST did not do this. This is what they did.
How many columns are in the building?
80. Look at that. That's what we saw. I hope we can all understand that that is exactly what the building did. So if NIST's model did that, they could say, oh yeah, we figured it out. But they didn't do that. How many columns had to go down? All of them. And they had to go down synchronously. The internal columns had to first get destroyed completely. And then 1.3 seconds or so later, the external columns were destroyed. This is not a fire.
Let's go back. If the internal columns were in elevator shafts, they
no, this is a different building.
I know, I understand, but so if we have to, if you're talking about putting charges on external columns and internal columns, how does somebody get to those places?
Well, I don't know. You know, here we're like, now we're speculating. I'm not sure. The elevator shafts are not designed like the tubular structure of the Twin Towers. So whoever planted the charges had access to all the building. And the reality is we have to start with what science tells us, right? The building had to have come down by controlled demolition. There's no question that that's what happened. So I don't know how they did it with Building 7. But it is clear that the science itself tells us that the building was blown up. There is no question that that's what happened. What I want to say, this is the last point here, okay? It took NIST did not come up with their explanation of Building 7 when they released the report with regards to the Twin Towers. This came out 3 years later. And the reason for that was they admitted that it was very difficult to figure out how this building could have come down. Of course, it was difficult because they did not entertain a controlled demolition hypothesis. So they had to come up with this model and, you know, work it so that it looked something like what we saw. And then they basically said, oh yeah, that's close enough for government work. So we'll call it the solution. So here I want to play, this is what's really interesting, is that that morning and that afternoon, everybody was telling us that Building 7 was going to come down. So this is a clip that my friend Ted Walter put together, which it's an interview with the deputy chief of the New York Fire Department on, I think, 60 Minutes, telling us what he was told that afternoon.
The deputy chief of the New York Fire Department that day remembers the scene.
Well, we had our special operations people set up surveying instruments to monitor and see if there was any movement of the building. We were concerned of the possibility of collapse of the building. And we had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in his current state you have about 5 hours.
So why didn't NIST ask the people on the ground how they knew the building was going to come down for sure? I mean, this is a steel structure building, only fires, unprecedented. Someone on the ground knew the building was going to come down. What did they know? Right? What is the secret ingredient? What's the special sauce here that everyone was aware of? but NIST didn't ask them. They just tried to, use mathematical mumbo jumbo to come up with some solution here. So there was foreknowledge of the building coming down. What do you think the people who were really in charge knew? And I think it's very fascinating that, he says they were right on the money, which is quite ironic, actually, because, this is all about money when you come right down to it. So anyway, the point here is that we were given a bullshit story about what happened and everybody bought it. And now let's talk about what this all means.
Yes.
What do you say, Meryl? Yeah.
Well, no. So the question is, why would someone do this? Cui bono, who benefits?
Yep.
And how was it that this happened exactly at the time all of these different exercises were going on with NORAD and the Defense Department, et cetera? So there was some sort of knowledge, at a minimum, knowledge that because these exercises were going on, many people would be confused as to whether this was an exercise, whether the story was true or whether it was part of an exercise. The other thing is, well, because these were Defense Department exercises, did the Defense Department have something to do with this? And if so, is the Defense Department has the ability to control information? So how would the Defense Department, if the Defense Department was involved with this, how would they benefit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know you're posing the question, but we all understand that the Defense Department and the military industrial complex are basically the same thing, and they benefit the most when we have threats. That's their raison d'etre, if you will. We need to have a threat, and we need to justify just an enormous amount of defense spending. It's odd that we call it defense spending as we, invade two countries and, destroy people's lives. And so, your point is correct. Like, whoever brought the buildings down, we may never know who the perpetrators are, but it clearly implicates military intelligence that had access to highly energetic explosives. Clearly, Meryl, you referred to these aerial exercises that were done by NORAD, simultaneously on the day that these buildings came down and these planes were flown into these buildings, if that's what happened. We also have the fact that, there was another very important building that was damaged that day, the Pentagon, the citadel of military might in this country, who, somehow got damaged by a plane, we're told. And all of the external cameras on that building, all that footage, well, we're not allowed to see it because that would be, a threat to national security. I mean, obviously, we're stating what's obvious. There had to have been a component of our Defense Department involved.
Right.
And there are, and then you asked cui bono, who does benefit? Like, who benefited the most from this besides our, the executives at Halliburton, the organization of Dick Cheney? I'm going to go ahead and put that out there. And before answering that question, I also want to state this, which is we saw all of mainstream media reporting explosions that morning, and then no more, no mention of that. That all stopped when BBC ran a very, very provocative interview that morning. And it was former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak somehow happened to be in London at the BBC studios at around 11 in the morning that time, just literally 33 minutes after the North Tower fell. And he was interviewed, and he basically contextualized the event. He said it was a terrorist attack, and we know who the likely suspects were. They were rogue states like Iraq, Libya, North Korea, and of course, Iran. And in his view, preemptive strikes were justified in his opinion, and he openly said that we now live in a different world.
Right. Now, he was just talking about the planes hitting the buildings, not anything else. So,
yes.
But then it turned out that the people on the planes were mostly Saudis and Egyptians. They didn't actually come from the countries that the United States then invaded, which were Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes. And what relevance does that have, Meryl? We just want to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. It doesn't matter who's on the planes. Yeah,
So
you're
we
exactly
know
right.
from George W. Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, Paul somebody, that when they constituted the cabinet at the beginning of George W. Bush's presidential reign, they were told, we are going to invade Iraq. We want to invade Iraq at the beginning of 2001, so roughly 7-8 months before the Twin Towers were hit.
Yes, I don't have I'm trying to remember the general who was basically telling us that that's what he was told and he couldn't believe it. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name.
This is the Secretary of the Treasury, Paul somebody, who said that later in a book he wrote.
I see. Yeah, there were multiple people who reported very high up that that was the plan, and they were scratching their heads as to how are we ever going to be able to pull this off. And it's also important to note that the executive director of the 9/11 Commission was Philip Zelikow. And this man was far from a objective scientific observer of the world. 3 years before 9/11, he co-authored a piece entitled "The Catastrophic Terrorism: Tackling the New Danger," where he and his co-authors anticipated the result of a large terrorist act. And he wrote this quote, which is very interesting. Quote, "Like Pearl Harbor, this event," and he's talking about a presumed event in the future, "would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures, scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and use of deadly force. More violence could follow, either further terrorist attacks or U.S. counterattacks. Belatedly, Americans would judge their leaders negligent for not addressing terrorism more urgently." So he wrote this in 1998. And Zelikow, as we know, or I'm letting you know, basically directed NIST to abandon their mission, which the public thought was to investigate the cause of the collapses, and instead just simply offer a hypothesis, a speculation, which excluded the possibility of explosives. And we ended up with the Patriot Act, which, granted powers to our government that are completely unconstitutional, and among all the provisions afforded to our authorities to protect us, I think the most controversial was indefinite detention of suspects based on evidence or on suspicion alone. I mean, this is just unbelievably unconstitutional. Imagine being condemned to punishment just on suspicion. Like, we're not living in America anymore. And yet those provisions were put into place a few days after 9/11, and they were maintained all the way up to 2020. And, it's just unimaginable what we did to people that we suspected were involved. I mean, we had CIA black spots, black sites.
I mean, they were pulling people off the streets and they were buying people. I mean, Iraqis would just kidnap somebody and say to the Americans, this guy was on the other side, and we'd give them a bounty, and we'd take that person and put them in Guantanamo or somewhere, send them somewhere else to be tortured and extract a fake confession from them. You're right. This was a complete change in the so-called rules-based order, which was, now we're not going to have any rules. It's just what we say are the rules. And Phil Zelikow was the deputy of Condoleezza Rice. And then he was later, he somehow managed to be the executive director of some other commission investigating COVID.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. So he's a cover-up king. And it's interesting that 3 years before 9/11, he was already able to predict what was going to happen, presumably because the whole thing had been planned in advance. And this, very visually provocative event or series of events, three towers in New York City, plus the Pentagon, and then some sort of a crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, were to lead to the global war on terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq with their underground resources, which we were really after, and a unipolar world order. Remember that in 2001, it was only 10 years after the fall of the Soviet system.
Right.
So the neocons in the United States were saying, okay, now we don't have to worry about Russia. China's not that strong yet. Let's go now and take over, and we're going to be number one, and we're going to have the unipolar system going forward forever. That was the plan, I think.
Yeah, you summarize it very well. And, I really appreciate the fact that we're taking the opportunity to speak about this event, because for me, as an engineer and a scientist that has come to this understanding of how the world works, and when I propose it to other people, and they look at me and say, how could you possibly believe, everything you're saying about the pandemic and the military, the highly militarized state that our country has come to? Why do you believe all that? And it's very hard for me to reconcile my position without going to 9/11. And I'm saying, look, if they did this, imagine what they're capable of. So, you remember
we
this.
could go back in history to the Maine. Remember the Maine? That was probably a false flag in 1898. So the United States could basically take Cuba and other colonies from Spain. We have the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was a false flag. We have, I forget the name of the ship that supposedly was bombed by the Egyptians, but was really bombed by Israelis, and we allowed
The
them
Liberty,
to
US.
the Liberty. What was the year of the Liberty?
I think it was in the 70s. I don't know.
60s or 70s, allowed them to kill Americans, and actually they wanted to sink the whole ship. They weren't able to do that, but we allowed Israel to attack one of our ships and potentially kill hundreds of Americans in order to make it seem that the Egyptians had done it and give us an excuse, to go after them and support Israel. So, this has been one. And we knew about Pearl Harbor before it happened, and we allowed Pearl Harbor to happen so we could get into World War II with the kind of justification we thought we needed.
And World War I must add, the Lusitania was clearly that was a lie hop, let it happen on purpose. All of the British protection of that ship was taken away right when the ship entered waters that we knew that the U-boats were patrolling. That ship was destroyed, and I think about 1,000 American lives were lost, and that was the instigating incident that led us into World War I. But look, I know we're closing down here, but here's what I want to say about this. When that happened, when we were that morning of September 11th, we all know where we were, people old enough at least. I was shocked at how our country could be so hated. Like, we were being told that these people, these 19 hijackers, would commandeer planes. And, we understand that, obviously we're not the best country out there. We're not very good stewards of peace. But these people jumped into planes, hijacked them, and flew them into buildings, taking their own lives. Now, imagine what must have been going through the heads, if this is the story, the minds of these Saudi hijackers as they were controlling these planes and just, 520 knots right into the South Tower, the North Tower. How can we possibly even consider the fact that someone could do that? And we were told, oh, they're monsters. They, they're looking for an afterlife, with 100 virgins or whatever, whatever. They're radical Islamic terrorists. This is what they do. This is how they think about the world. And that was very hard for me to accept. And in the years following, the story kept coming up. It's like, well, they're radical Islamic terrorists. This is what they do. Now, think about this. If that wasn't the story, think about the monstrosity of the people who engineered this event to get the entire world to think that that's what happened. I mean, the antipathy, the malevolence is, a degree of magnitude even higher. This is what we're up against.
Look, I think, though, you're dismissing something. I mean, there are suicide bombers. In Japan during World War II, there were kamikaze pilots. People are willing to sacrifice their lives for something they believe in. Whether that is what happened, when these planes hit the buildings, that's still in question. Some people think there were drone planes that didn't have any people in them. We just don't know.
We don't know, but the point is, let me push back at that for 1 second. Yes, there were kamikaze pilots, but they were in a desperate situation. That was a defensive move to save the empire. We're talking about starting an event, with giving your life.
But there are people who wear suicide vests even today.
Yeah, well, yes, there's suicidal.
I mean, people are trained to believe certain things, and some of them are hypnotized, and it's possible. But and if there were drones hitting those buildings, then what happened to the planes and the people on them? That's another.
These are very good questions. And to be honest with you, the truth community is divided about this, whether there were drones or whether it was a uninterruptible autopilot that was remotely initiated. It is clear that the pilots were not trained to fly these multi-engine jet planes with that kind of accuracy. And there are professional pilots who have trained, for thousands of hours, who could not duplicate their maneuvers even on a simulator. Like, forget about in a hijack situation where you're expecting the world's greatest air force to be behind you, to just do it on a simulator.
Sure. I mean, I can believe that, but I also can believe, since it happened, that a computer could do it.
I'm sorry, you don't believe that a computer could do it?
No, I'm saying because it did happen.
Yeah.
Whether or not these people were capable of doing it, a computer could do it because something did it.
Something did it. Yes. Well, this kind of plan was hatched in 1962. We know that President Kennedy was approached by his advisors saying, look, we need a reason to invade Cuba, and we know how to do it. It's very, very simple. We have, a bunch of CIA operatives that charter a private plane that leaves Miami or wherever. And while in flight, we will bring a drone aircraft next to it, exchange transponder signals. The chartered flight lands at an Air Force base. All the aliases are maintained. We don't know what happened to these people, but the drone aircraft is crashed over Cuba. It's transponding the signal of the chartered flight. Everybody on the ground will think that the plane was shot down. And now we have an excuse to invade Cuba. And of course, Kennedy said, no, of course I'm not going to do that. This is called Operation Northwood. So we had the technology to do this in 1962. So, that's, again, we're speculating, but that would be a pretty reasonable way of doing this. I'm not saying that's what happened, but to say that what happened? They must have flown into the buildings. No, they don't have to do that at all. We have the technology to make it look like that's what happened. Absolutely. But, in the end, though, the reason why this is important is that we may not know who the true conspirators are, but we know who one of the conspirators was. Absolutely. It's legacy media. They could never pull the story off if legacy media did not get on the same, say it the same way, tell the same story across the board. This is what they're doing. This is their biggest asset, is the control of the media, because you control the media, you control the entire narrative. It's very, very difficult because legacy media legitimizes whatever opinion you throw out there, even though it's not scientific.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Control the media, you control the people. You control the media and you control the food, and we're, we have nothing.
That's right.
And they've already got the media, and now they're working on the food. So
that's next. Well, there's always something to attack and kill and destroy and make us weaker and sicker. But this is an important point, and it does fall into the context, I think, of all of this. I think that the 9/11 Truth Movement has, in some sense, stalled because we're not contextualizing it properly. Because I think the pandemic, if you will, is an enormous opportunity, because we have a lot of minds that are waking up to the fact that we're being lied to. Whether it be about COVID or not, and now we have fertile soil to reintroduce the idea of what happened on 9/11. This is a really, we have to use the lemons to make lemonade. This is an opportunity for us. And I think that's why this conversation is going to be very important. Whether or not it gets a lot of traction right now at the right around the 23rd anniversary of 9/11 or in the future, I think it's important that this conversation gets recorded for posterity and hopefully it'll be referenced by other people.
Well, what I want to say is that we've just talked about a whole series of events that were either false flag events or allowed to happen that we expected to happen, like Pearl Harbor. That our government, as well as others, have been involved with these sorts of things forever, for at least 125 years. And they will continue to happen unless we stop them. And they have, there are strong geopolitical reasons to create these types of events. And once we are able to see them for what they are in real time, they lose their power to affect us in the future. So it's very important that we look with fresh eyes every time we have one of these deep political events. The Kennedy assassination in '63 being one of them. Why did this happen? Who did it? What was gained? And if we can turn these things over, if we can actually make sense of it and everyone come to an agreement that of what actually happened, we can stop the perpetrators from using this type of strategy to control us, to bring us into wars and other unpleasant episodes in the future.
Well, they're happening all around us right now today. We're still we're recording this a little bit earlier, but we just had another assassination attempt, and there are a lot of questions about what really happened that day. Obviously, it's another huge topic, but yes, we need to look at things with fresh eyes and understand that that is the plan.
Thank you very much, Madhava, for coming on and bringing up a tough subject that we shouldn't forget about. And thank you for explaining it.
Yeah, Meryl, thank you for having me. And I think we did as good a job as anyone could do in an hour or a little bit after that. This is a very huge topic. And I encourage everyone to look, with your own eyes, keep them fresh, do your own research, and understand that this is a vital part of our movement towards liberating ourselves.
Thank you.